Hey folks, Mr. Howard here again in my guest room. Today's final video, I'm going to read chapter 1. The whole idea of this is it's a read aloud with analysis. So I'm going to read you the story, stopping every now and again to talk about little bits and pieces that I think are important or that just catch my fancy. And hopefully, you notice some of these too. If you have things that you notice that you want to talk about that I didn't catch or I didn't mention, feel free to drop them on my page, leave me some comments, message me, whatever. And we can discuss that. That'll be fun. So, chapter 1. The studio was filled with the rich odor of roses, and when the light summer wind stirred amid the trees of the garden, there came through the open door the heavy scent of the lilac, or the more delicate perfume of the pink flowering thorn. So we start out with this imagery that's very sensual. We're going to have garden images, animal images, flower images, a lot of scent and smell. The garden setting is going to be really important. We hinted that this was an allegory. You want to pay attention to that. From the corner of the divan of Persian saddlebags, on which he was lying, smoking as was his custom, innumerable cigarettes, Lord Henry Wotton could just catch the gleam of the honey-sweet and honey-colored blossoms of a laburnum, whose tremulous branches seemed hardly able to bear the burden of a beauty so flame-like as theirs, and now and then the fantastic shadows of birds in flight flitted across the long tussore silk curtains that were stretched in front of the huge window, procuring a kind of momentary Japanese effect, and making him think of those pallid, jade-faced painters of Tokyo who, through the medium of an art that is necessarily immobile, seek to convey the sense of swiftness and motion. Now, obviously, this book is immobile too, so maybe there's a connection there. And a divan of Persian saddlebags. A divan is like a one-armed couch. It's made out of Persian saddlebags, like repurposed leather. The opulence, the luxury of this scene, I think, is supposed to affect you. It's obviously upper-class Britain. The sullen murmur of the bees shouldering their way through the long unmown grass, or the circling with monotonous insistence round the dusty gilt horns of the straggling woodbine seemed to make the stillness more oppressive. The dim roar of London was like a bourdon note of a distant organ. So we're in London. This is the exposition, right? We're getting some background information. That was a nice simile too. The center of the room, an organ too, is a church instrument. Is that important? I don't know. In the center of the room, clamped to an upright easel, stood a full-length portrait of a young man of extraordinary personal beauty, and in front of it, some little distance away, was sitting the artist himself, Basil Hallward, whose sudden disappearance some years ago caused at the time such public excitement, and gave rise to so many strange conjectures. Foreshadowing. All right, clearly Basil's going to disappear at some point in the future, and they just told us this. This omniscient narrator knows all, and it shows up here. As the painter looked at the gracious and comely form he had so skillfully mirrored in his art, a smile of pleasure passed across his face, and seemed about to linger there. But he suddenly started up, and closing his eyes, placed his fingers upon the lids, as though he sought to imprison within his brain some curious dream from which he feared he might awake. This is interesting. This is a connection to Romanticism, right? He feels he's in a dream. The painting is too beautiful to be real. He's afraid he's going to wake from it. There's an unreality about the painting. Maybe that's Romanticism versus realism. Maybe we've got a theme here. That's what I'd annotate anyway. It is your best work, Basil. The best thing you have ever done. Pause. I'm going to put voices in here. Get used to it. That's my Lord Henry voice. I'm not changing it. It is your best work, Basil, the best thing you have ever done, said Lord Henry languidly. I think it's interesting, too, maybe paradoxical, that he says it's his greatest work, but he says it in this, I'm bored of the world voice, like he really doesn't care. It's typically British, typically Victorian upper-class British, and Lord Henry represents that sort of a character. He's almost a caricature of that type of character. You must certainly send it next year to the Grosvenor. The Academy is too large and too vulgar. Whenever I have gone there have been either so many people that I have not been able to see the pictures, which was dreadful, or so many pictures that I have not been able to see the people, which was worse. The Grosvenor is really the only place. I don't think I shall send it anywhere, he answered, tossing his head back in that odd way that used to make his friends laugh at him at Oxford. No, I won't send it anywhere. Pause. Basil has an odd way of throwing his head back and laughing that makes people, sort of laugh at him. That's weird. It's your first hint, I think, that Basil is a character, might be gay. Remember that gay was a crime in Victorian times, so whatever Basil has is going to be really understated. But let's pay attention to the clues through the rest of the chapter and see if we can dig down on that. I think that's just sort of your first hint that's been put out there. Lord Henry elevated his eyebrows and looked at him in amazement through the thin blue wreaths of smoke that curled up in such fanciful whirls from his heavy opium-tainted cigarette. Opium. Yep. So again, Lord Henry associated with sin. Remember, I told you he might be a Satan character. You'll see that as we go through. Not send it anywhere, my dear fellow. Why? Have you any reason? What odd chaps you painters are. You do anything in the world to gain a reputation. As soon as you have one, you seem to want to throw it away. It is silly of you, for there is only one thing in the world worse than being talked about, and that is not being talked about. A portrait like this would set you far above all the young men in England, and make the old men quite jealous, if old men are ever capable of any emotion. I know you will laugh at me, he replied, but I really can't exhibit it. I have put too much of myself into it. Lord Henry stretched himself out on the divan and laughed. Yes, Yes, I knew you would, but it is quite true all the same. Too much of yourself in it. Upon my word, Basil, I didn't know you were so vain. And I really can't see any resemblance between you with your rugged, strong face and your coal-black hair and this young Adonis, who looks as if he was made of ivory and rose leaves. Why, my dear Basil, he is a Narcissus, and you, well, of course you have an intellectual expression and all that, but beauty, real beauty, ends where an intellectual expression begins. Pause. Note that Lord Henry is making all kinds of Greek allusions, in his discussion. Again, we talked about him maybe representing Hellenism or Greek ideals versus medieval ideals. I think that's important. Also, there's a clear separation of art and intellectualism, I think, which comes across here, especially in this following paragraph, that I think is important. Pay attention to this paragraph. I'm not going to analyze it, but if Lord Henry is a Satan figure, what is he saying about intellectualism and how it can be used as a device to escape morality? If you can think about things logically, maybe you don't have to think about things emotionally. Maybe you don't have to be morally invested. Where was I? But beauty, real beauty, ends where an intellectual expression begins. Intellect is itself a mode of exaggeration and destroys the harmony of any face. The moment one sits down to think, one becomes all nose or all forehead or something horrid. Look at the successful men in any of the learned professions. How perfectly hideous they are, except of course in the church. But then in the church they don't think. A bishop keeps saying at the age of 80 what he was taught to say when he was a boy of 18, and as a natural consequence he always looks absolutely delightful. Your mysterious young friend, whose name you've never told me, but whose picture really fascinates me, never thinks. I feel quite sure of that. He is some brainless, beautiful creature who should always be here in the winter when we have no flowers to look at, and always here in the summer when we want something to chill our intelligence. Don't flatter yourself, Basil. You are not in the least like him. You don't understand me, Harry, answered the artist. Of course I'm not like him. I know that perfectly well. Indeed, I should be sorry to look like him. You shrug your shoulders? I am telling you the truth. There is a fatality about all physical and intellectual distinction, the sort of fatality that seems to dog through history the faltering steps of kings. It is better not to be different from one's fellows. The ugly and the stupid have the best of it in this world. They can sit at their ease and gape at the play. If they know nothing of victory, they are at least spared the knowledge of defeat. They live as we all should live, undisturbed, indifferent, and without disquiet. They neither bring ruin upon others, nor ever receive it from alien hands. Your rank and wealth, Harry, my brains, such as they are, my art, whatever it may be worth, Dorian Gray's good looks, we shall suffer for what the gods have given us. Suffer terribly. Pause, is that foreshadowing? I think it is. Also, is that like a moral lesson of the story? It's better to be a mediocrity than to be somebody who's great, because greatness brings upon you great harm. Is that like a connection to tragedy? Are we connecting this to tragedies and drama and how sort of great figures are lightning rods for the suffering of others and for themselves? I think so. I think he's definitely connecting to his literary roots here. Dorian Gray, is that his name? Asked Lord Henry, walking across the studio toward Basil Hallward. Yes, that's his name. I didn't intend to tell it to you. But why not? Oh, I can't explain. When I like people immensely, I never tell their names to anyone. It's like surrendering a part of them. I have grown to love secrecy. It seems to be the one thing that can make modern life mysterious or marvelous to us. The commonest thing is delightful if one only hides it. When I leave town now, I never tell my people where I am going. If I did, I would lose all my pleasure. It's a silly habit, I dare say, but somehow it brings a great deal of romance into one's life. I suppose you think me awfully foolish about it. Pause. Didn't it say he was going to disappear? I mean, I feel like these two things are connected. It's still building that foreshadowing about him. Not at all, answered Lord Henry. Not at all, my dear Basil. You seem to forget that I am married, and the one charm of marriage is that it makes a life of deception absolutely necessary for both parties. I never know where my wife is, and my wife never knows what I am doing. When we meet, and we do meet occasionally, when we dine out together or go down to the Duke's, we tell each other the most absurd stories with the most serious faces. My wife is very good at it, much better, in fact, than I am. She never gets confused over her dates, and I always do. But when she does find me out, she makes no row at all. I sometimes wish she would, but she merely laughs at me. Again, here's Lord Henry and his immoral ideas about marriage and society. I hate the way you talk about your married life, Harry, said Basil Hallward, strolling toward the door that led into the garden. I believe that you really are a very good husband, but that you are thoroughly ashamed of your own virtues. You're an extraordinary fellow. You never say a moral thing, and you never do a wrong thing. Your cynicism is simply a pose. Again, there's that Satan vibe going on. He's ashamed of his own virtues. I think that's an interesting line. But you can see here that Basil's a romantic. He thinks the best of Henry, even when Henry says things directly to the contrary. Being natural is simply a pose, and the most irritating pose I know, cried Lord Henry, laughing, and the two young men went out into the garden together and ensconced themselves on a long bamboo seat that stood in the shade of a tall laurel bush. The sunlight slipped over the polished leaves and the grass. White daisies were tremulous. Pause again. He uses the word tremulous too much. You'll also find that people are always flinging themselves around in this story. A couple of, I feel like, stylistic errors that maybe weren't caught in editing. It is what it is. After a pause, Lord Henry pulled out his watch. I'm afraid I must be going, Basil, he murmured. And before I go, I insist on your answering a question I put to you some time ago. What is that? Said the painter, keeping his eyes fixed on the ground. The hint here in body language, Basil continues to look at the ground, which means that he knows what Lord Henry is going to ask him, and he's trying to avoid it. This is important when you see what the question is. You know quite well. I do not, Harry. Well, I will tell you what it is. I want you to explain to me why you won't exhibit Dorian Gray's picture. I want the real reason. I told you the real reason. No, you did not. You said it was because there was too much of yourself in it. Now that is childish. Harry, said Basil Hallward, looking him straight in the face, every portrait that is painted with feeling is a portrait of the artist, not the sitter. Pause. That flies in the face of the preface, but the character is not the author, right? So what does it mean that Oscar Wilde puts a different artistic philosophy in the mind of his painter than he himself espouses in the preface? I don't know, I'm just going to let that one sit. Every portrait that is painted with feeling is a portrait of the artist, not of the sitter. The sitter is merely the accident, the occasion. It is not he who is revealed by the painter, it is rather the painter who, on the colored canvas, reveals himself. The reason I will not exhibit this picture is that I am afraid that I have shown in it the secret of my own soul. That's obvious, too. Like, what is the secret of Basil's soul? What is it that he's afraid Victorian society is going to guess about him? Rewind to the earlier statement where I suggested that maybe he was gay. More evidence? Let's keep reading. Lord Henry laughed. And what is that? He asked. I will tell you, said Hallward, but an expression of perplexity came over his face. I am all expectation, Basil, continued his companion, glancing at him. Oh, there's very little to tell, really, Harry, answered the painter. I'm afraid you will hardly understand it. Perhaps you will hardly believe it? Lord Henry smiled, and leaning down, plucked a pink-petaled daisy from the grass and examined it. I am quite sure I shall understand it, he replied, gazing intently at the little golden-white feathered disc. And as for believing things, I can believe anything, provided that it is incredible. The wind shook some blossoms from the trees, and the heavy lilac blooms with their clustering stars moved to and fro in the languid air. A grasshopper began to chirp by the wall, and like a blue thread a long thin dragonfly floated past on its brown gauze wings. Lord Henry felt as if he could hear Basil Hallward's heart beating, and wondered what was coming. The story is simply this, said the painter after some time. 2 months ago I went to a crush at the Lady Brandon's. Pause. A crush is a party. You ever been at a party where people are so crushed together that they can't move? It was a really, really crowded party. They called it a crush in Victorian times. I went to a crush at Lady Brandon's. You know, we poor artists have to go show ourselves in society from time to time, just to remind the public that we are not savages. With an evening coat and a white tie, as you once told me, anybody, even a stockbroker, can gain a reputation for being civilized. Well, after I had been in the room about 10 minutes talking to huge, overdressed dowagers and tedious academicians, I suddenly became conscious that someone was looking